Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're really excited to have you join us today, in the webinar that is the first in the thematic session webinar series as part of the Edinburgh process. And thank you for joining us, whether it's in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, wherever you are in the world. We really appreciate you taking the time. And we really are thrilled to be having this discussion and to be having it with a very exciting panel who is joining us today. Before I introduce myself and the speakers, I would like to briefly just hand over to Dr. Sue Campbell from the Scottish Government, and she's going to just help us to situate this specific webinar in the broader Edinburgh process. So Sue, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to you and your ICLEI colleagues and the speakers for putting together this themed webinar, which is part of the Edinburgh process. As you said, I'm Sue Campbell and I'm from the Scottish Government's Biodiversity Unit. And I just thought it would be useful to set this webinar into the context of the Edinburgh process, which we talked a lot about last week in our regional sessions. So to give it its, if you can move on to the next slide, please, Tim. To give it its full name, the Edinburgh process for subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or Edinburgh process for short, it's been developed to ensure that the views and aspirations of authorities that sit below the level of national and state level are included in the post-2020 framework. And that includes the views of regional governments and local authorities and cities. As you're all aware, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity are currently developing a new framework that will be finalised at COP15 in China next year. And given the key role of subnational actors in delivering biodiversity at local levels, it's right that our views are fed into the process so that realistic and deliverable actions can be taken. And we've developed this process with our Edinburgh process partners, and on the right hand side of this slide you can see all the partners included, and these are organisations that play a leading role within the subnational constituency. If we move on to the next slide, please, Tim. The Edinburgh process began on the 24th of April this year, and it continues right up until COP15. As I said last week, we held our first series of regional information sessions outlining the Edinburgh process, and that's what the yellow box signifies here. And if you've missed any of those sessions, we'll be posting them up on the YouTube channel this week, which you can, and you can find those through Attendify. We've got our consultation documents out for your comments, and they're all through the Attendify app. And I'm delighted that we're able to deliver themed webinars, which you can see set out in the red box there. And we've put together a few webinars to really talk about in some detail about issues that are included in the framework and which are central to the role of subnational authorities. The webinars will be held across the coming weeks, and we'll use key issues arising from these discussions to feed back to the CBD and to set out the stronger role for subnational actors within the framework. So I would like to congratulate ICLEI on developing today's exciting webinar to discuss reporting and monitoring tools. The monitoring framework is a key part of the current Zero draft, and I hope that today's discussion will enable us all to explore the important role of subnational authorities in implementing biodiversity actions with regards to monitoring and reporting. And I'm excited to hear from the perspective of our panel of speakers today, and really excited to find out what kind of discussion this stimulates and experiences we can all share together so that we can improve how we deliver for biodiversity in the future. So with that, I'll hand you back to Tim and our speakers and look forward to the rest of the webinar. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Sue, and thank you for joining us. It's my honor to be moderating this webinar today. My name is Timothy Blatch. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Centre and also the global coordinator of the Cities with Nature Partnership Initiative. I will be your moderator today, but also a panelist as I present on the Cities with Nature initiative. But what is more exciting is that we are joined by some really exciting speakers today. And you can see them up on your screen now. We have Mr. Jeremy Yap. He is the manager for International Biodiversity Conservation at the National Parks Board of Singapore. We also have Mr. Russell Galt, who's the head of the IUCN Urban Alliance. And we also are joined by Ms. Julie Dewar, who's the senior planner in the City of Edinburgh Council. So a very exciting lineup of speakers, and I want to just take this moment to thank each of them for their contributions and for being with us today. Before we get going, just a few house rules in a sense, just to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you through Attendify, and if I'm not mistaken, YouTube as well. We are going to have a series of presentations by the speakers. Thereafter, we will open the floor to some questions and discussion. So we ask that you hold your questions until that point, whereby there will be different ways in which you can ask a question, either by using the chat box or by using in the right-hand panel, you can either raise your hand or, yeah, as I've mentioned, use the chat box. So just very quickly to run over today's agenda, it's my privilege to introduce the webinar and welcome everyone to the process. I will then present briefly on Cities with Nature and the Cities with Nature commitment platform. Thereafter, I will hand over to Russell, who will present on the IUCN Urban Nature Index that is under development. And after him, Jeremy Yap will present on the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, which is very excitingly being reviewed. And straight after that, I'll hand over to Julie, last but not least, to give some experiences from Edinburgh. And all of this will happen before we open the floor to some questions and discussion. So who am I? My name is Timothy Blatch, as I've said. And I work with ICLEI in the Cities Biodiversity Centre. I'm a city and regional planner is actually my background, but my primary responsibility at ICLEI is supporting on the local and subnational government advocacy agenda, as well as driving the global partnership initiative Cities with Nature. So ICLEI is the leading network of over 1,700 cities, towns, and regions committed to building a sustainable urban future. And through our dedicated Cities Biodiversity Centre, this is where we seek to mainstream biodiversity and nature-based solutions, but also support cities from across the globe on biodiversity and this mainstreaming agenda. So it's my privilege on behalf of ICLEI and the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre to welcome you as we host this webinar as part of the Edinburgh process. ICLEI is the focal point to the UN, the Rio Conventions, which is the UNFCCC, the UNCCD, and the UNCBD, on behalf of the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments. And this sort of sets the scene for our advocacy work that I will briefly introduce. So at the moment, ICLEI, along with many of our partners, are running a process that we commonly call the roadmap to COP15 for local and subnational governments. And what you can see on your screen now is really a timeline of key milestones and events or opportunities where the voice of our local and subnational government constituency will be represented in building momentum for a really strong position that will then be presented at COP15, where our constituency is calling for a dedicated stepped up decision on local and subnational governments to renew the plan of action that has been in effect for the last decade. There's more on that on Attendify, and we have recently completed a review of that current plan of action, which we're asking for inputs through the Edinburgh consultation process. So through our advocacy work, ICLEI has a number of different platforms where our constituency can engage, and this is some of the we, for example, have a monthly news update that we send out. We have a dedicated platform that houses all the information on the roadmap, and we encourage you to check that out. This graphic here really just shows how we are gaining momentum and mobilizing the constituency as we move closer and closer towards COP. And as we know, COVID-19 has thrown the timeline of events slightly off, and COP will now likely take place in 2021. But what I want to highlight here is you can see the Cities with Nature logo, where this is really, I will introduce it in more detail, but this is really a key mechanism through which we are demonstrating the contributions being made by the constituency and feeding them into the overall advocacy process. So Cities with Nature, just a quick introduction, is really a shared platform, an online platform to strengthen collective action to mainstream nature into our cities and surrounding regions in support of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This platform, although primarily for cities and regions, is soon to be opened up to a range of other user groups in order to allow, we're trying to build and nurture a community of practice and really a big tent or one-stop shop for everything around urban nature. And we hope that you will come on board and help us and support us in this journey. So where did Cities with Nature come from? It builds on a decade of work done by a number of cities through our local Action for Biodiversity project. That was a very successful project, and that was in high demand, so much so that we took the methodology and have transformed it into a dynamic and interactive online process for cities to engage with. And therefore, Cities with Nature provides a useful vehicle to track trends over time and show how cities are doing in regards to urban nature and how they are making progress in achieving their own goals, as well as achieving national targets and the targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we launched Cities with Nature in 2018. And we're really excited. As of last year, we have our first nature pathway on the city's registry, where cities are able to log in, build their profiles as the basis for engagement, and share their work and really engage with the rich material that we now offer. What's really exciting, and you can see on your screen, is that Cities with Nature has been recognized by the SCBD and accepted as the official vehicle to leverage and report on commitments to the post-2020 framework by local and subnational governments. By harnessing the power of global partnerships, Cities with Nature enables a collaborative space of co-development and co-creation. And I want to draw your attention here to the fact that Cities with Nature is not an ICLEI product alone. It was founded by ICLEI, the Nature Conservancy, and the IUCN. And we have many other partners who are coming on board to help us co-shape the initiative and develop it further. So what you see on your screen now is really a demonstration of the nature pathway, which is really our attempt to scale up a tried and tested methodology, which you can see on your screen. It's the Analyze, Act, and Accelerate methodology, which is broken down into a number of different sub-steps, and in its totality creates a 27-step process for cities to really engage with. And I will show you now what that engagement looks like in a second. So there are four main components on Cities with Nature, and you can see those on your screen. We have the registry for cities, and a commitment platform that I will provide some more detail on in this presentation, as well as a community hub and knowledge and research hub, which is for urban communities and researchers and practitioners to also engage with the work that cities are doing. So to date, we have over 140 cities who have joined the initiative and who are coming on board to really embark on this exciting journey. Sorry, if I go back for a second, I just want to highlight where the sort of monitoring and reporting aspect comes in. And it really sits between the city's registry, which is where the pathway is, and our commitment platform. And I will aim to demonstrate that today. So how are cities engaging? You can see the methodology here again. And I want to draw your attention to the city profile on the right. This is an example of a profile that a city creates and has full control over. And as they engage with each step of the pathway, you can see that the spiral motif lights up to show their progress along this journey. So just to highlight, we have a number of cities who are actively engaged, including Montreal, Barcelona, Lagos, London, and many others as examples. So the nature pathway, if I can explain it as a journey that you can see on your screen here, guides the city through these steps and really allows them the flexibility to enter the pathway at any stage that makes sense to them. So in this sense, we meet the city where they are, and a city can come in and out at any step. It's not linear, and they are able to, at each step, engage with what we call a prompt page that you can see on your screen now. So this, by means of demonstration, is step one of our pathway, which is really around securing an initial commitment from the city. And you can see on the right, we provide some information around what this step means and why this step is important. And then we provide a statement. Our city has made a political commitment to being a city with nature. And in the event that the city has done this, we ask them to upload a file to demonstrate. And this is really where they can now share their work and inspire other cities to do the same. And in the event that they have not, we provide the tools, resources, and examples for them to really equip the city to do so. And as a city is capacitated to undertake the step, and once they do and make an upload, that's when we really show the progress that they've made, and that is reflected on their city profile. So in this way, the pathway itself is already a powerful tool for monitoring. And what you can see on your screen now is an example of the 3 different tabs on a city profile. And I'm using Melbourne and the Los Angeles profiles by means of demonstration here. But what you can see in the tab on the right is, for example, the documents that Los Angeles has shared, which are now available to inspire other cities through the platform. In the middle, we can see what the progress that the city of Melbourne has made. And these are, you know, the different steps have been lit up based on what documents the city has shared. And in this way, the pathway allows us a really nice qualitative way of monitoring a city's progress, in the sense that it focuses more on the sort of process aspects around the planning, the implementation of projects. It's less concerned about sort of species counting and the quantitative numbers, but it really allows us to capture rich data from the cities and build a repository of what cities are doing. So most excitingly, I want to draw your attention to the commitment platform that is currently under development. And this is thanks to support from the Natureation project, as well as the post-2020 global framework, biodiversity framework, EU support project that is helping us develop this commitment platform. And really what we envision the commitment platform to be is a space where cities and regions, local and subnational governments can set targets and indicators in relation to urban actions and commitments that we are asking them to make. And really what this process does is it pulls right from, you know, from the current zero draft and the monitoring framework that Sue mentioned earlier. You can see in the zero draft itself, there's a series of goals and action targets that we are trying to distill into a series of local and subnational targets and indicators for the more urban components of the global framework to be monitored and reported on effectively by local and subnational governments. So I'm really excited to share in this webinar the very first sneak peek of where we're at on this commitment platform. And this is, please, by no means exhaustive. This is just to try and demonstrate what we're trying to achieve and how it will fit into the overall Cities with Nature platform. You can see on the left an example of an urban commitment or target, and in this case, the high-level target is the conservation and restoration of ecosystems, and we are asking the city to show us how they're doing this in setting a baseline, and then by filling in some little blanks, we're enabling a flexible approach for a city to set the targets that make sense to them. And you can just see on the right that the aim is that the targets they set will then be reflected on their city's profiles. And by means of demonstration, I've tried to come up with what, a very simplistic way to demonstrate what this might look like. And let's take the example of recreating natural habitat. So we set a baseline with the city that the area of natural habitat is currently X amount and will be increased to Y in by 2030 through recreation. And the idea is once a city would sort of tick to commit to this and set the target, that this target would then be shown, as you can see on the right, on their profile. And as they come back to the commitment platform and periodically report and monitor their progress, we aim to show this progress along a bar that sort of has the baseline of 2020 on the one side, and their target that they've set, in this case to 2030, and where we aim to show the trend over time and how the city is progressing. So one of the ways in which we will allow this monitoring to take place is through cities being able to post updates on their profile. And in this case, this is an example of Barcelona rewilding some of their natural areas. And this is just to demonstrate how a city might make an upload when they post an update and really tag it alongside the commitments and targets that they've made, in this case restoration, which will then show a progression in terms of how they're doing. And in that way, we can really monitor the progress. Then periodically, we can have a city revisit the commitment platform and report on the progress that they've made. And the aim here is that these commitments, in their totality, if we add up and tally all of the work that cities are doing and achieving these commitments, we aim to show this on a really nice dashboard that would essentially, allow us to present a full picture of the local and subnational constituency and providing us the evidence to mobilize this voice. And this is just to demonstrate the various city profiles that are currently active and now over 140 cities and where they are in the world. And really, Cities with Nature then is a very powerful tool for mobilizing this collective action in demonstrating the ways that cities are engaging, offering a means through which they can measure their progress and achieve their commitments, growing and strengthening this virtual community of practice that is committed to raising ambition, especially at this critical moment. And really, what we're able to do, once cities start making commitments and reporting and measuring, is really demonstrate the critical role of this constituency. So that's it from me for now. Thank you for listening. And here are some contact information if you'd like to get in contact with us. But I know we do need to move on. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our next speaker and panelist, Mr. Russell Galt. And he's the head of IUCN's Urban Alliance, which is a broad coalition of IUCN constituents working towards greener cities. And Russell, it's wonderful to have you on the call. And thank you for your contributions. It's always a pleasure to work with you. So without further ado, I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Timothy. I appreciate the welcoming remarks. I'm going to give you a cue of next every time I would like you to make a slide transition. Is that okay?
That's perfect, Russell.
So next, please. Okay, so Yes, my name's Russell. I work for the IUCN Urban Alliance, which is a relatively new initiative. It's an attempt to incorporate urban dimensions of nature conservation across the work of IUCN. Next, please. Before I give you a bit of background on IUCN, I just wanted to paraphrase the great Lord Kelvin. You may be familiar with this quote. It's been paraphrased as, if you cannot measure it, then you cannot improve it. And I think that's absolutely essential for what we're discussing today. We've got to provide the metrics and methodologies to measure the ecological performance of our cities. Next, please. So IUCN, just a bit of background, is an old organization spanning 7 decades. We're a membership-based organization comprising both government and civil society, including ICLEI and others. And we have some 15,000 experts spread across 6 commissions worldwide. We're globally active, and you may be familiar with the World Conservation Congress, which has been postponed for obvious reasons until January. And we hope to have a strong cities focus there. So I just wanted to flag that. Now, our mission is a just world that values and conserves nature, but we've come to realize, next please, that it's impossible to achieve that mission if we don't engage cities, because cities are impacting almost everywhere on the planet, even the remotest remnants of wilderness. So next, please. So a few years ago, we set up the Urban Alliance, or a couple of years ago, the Urban Alliance, at the behest of IUCN members, and with the funding support of Arcadia, a charitable fund of Lisbeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin. And one of our initial objectives in the Urban Alliance, which is this broad coalition of IUCN constituents, is to develop an urban nature index to measure change and to drive action. Next, please. So I experienced last night the paradox of choice. I tried to buy an air pollution sensor, and I spent far too long looking for one because there were just way too many options. And each of them, I'm sure, attempts to do the same thing in a slightly different way. And that is actually what we see in this landscape of indicators available to cities, that different institutions develop, promote, and prescribe different indicators, often developed in isolation. This impedes meaningful comparisons over space and time. And as a standard setting organization, IUCN is well placed to try to address this challenge and to promote streamlining and harmonization. Excuse me, 1 second. Alexa, please stop. I didn't expect Alexa to be bothering me during a webinar like this, but anyway, forgive me. And IUCN could help to streamline and harmonize these indicators. Next, please. And this is important because, of course, we have this biodiversity crisis, because cities have agency to either profoundly ameliorate or exacerbate this ecological emergency. Next, please. And of course, because all of us, all stakeholders, need to get behind the CBD post-2020 framework, we need to shore up support from across society. So IUCN established this technical expert group comprising experts drawn from across the union, both members, commissions, and the secretariat. And we convened in Paris last year. Next, please. And we set about developing an urban nature index. After some deliberation and debate, we agreed to the following principles. Next, please. So firstly, we need to address 3 spheres of impact. Urban nature is really important. We know that for climate resilience, for human health and well-being, for disaster risk reduction, for food security, water security, it's really important, but it's not everything. We also have to consider the often parasitic relationship that cities have on their surrounding hinterland. So we need to consider the bioregion. That could be the watershed. And it just goes beyond the administrative boundaries of the city. And then additionally, we need to consider the global impacts, or the telecoupled, often called embodied impacts of cities through their consumption and production. And this is where ecological footprinting comes into the picture. Next, please. So another principle we agreed to is that we want to align with existing frameworks and standards. And there are many out there. The CBD monitoring framework that's in development, or the new urban agenda, which is ripe with many transformative commitments pertaining to urban ecology. And then, of course, the Singapore Index, which is perhaps the best known and most comprehensive and widely tested urban nature index. And then various interesting studies that have emerged in recent years, such as the Making Nature City report, a science-based framework for building urban biodiversity. These have many framework standards and principles that we seek to align with and create synergies rather than duplication. Next, please. Thanks. And we also want to integrate existing tools. Now, there are many out there: the red list of threatened species, the green list of protected areas, the red list of ecosystems. We want to incorporate these as much as possible. And this is important, next please, because we want to also streamline data collection and limit the need for any new and additional data collection. So wherever possible, we should try to utilize existing data sets. Next, please. And of course, we want to add value to the work of cities. It's not fair or realistic to expect cities to just take on board more reporting and implementing of indicators if there's not added value to their work. We understand the resource constraints, the time constraints. So ideally, an urban nature index should help to create a more responsive government that can better improve the environment. Next, please. And we want this to be accessible to a broad range of cities. So whether it's New York or Nairobi, it shouldn't matter. It should be accessible to all the cities that wish to implement it. Next, please. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly examine a few of the spheres of impact that I spoke about. So firstly, on the global sphere of impact, we've been working with the British Columbia Institute of Technology, ICLEI, and Urban Biodiversity Hub to develop an ecological footprinting methodology that is nuanced and augmented with consumer survey data. Next, please. In fact, you can actually just skip probably 3 or 4 slides forward. I'm very conscious that we're running behind schedule. Thank you, Timothy. So one more, please. So based on the research of Jenny Moore, who has undertaken extensive ecological footprinting analyses of cities worldwide, we distilled 4 or 5 categories where we think cities should focus their attention. If they really want to curb their ecological footprint, then they should look at food, buildings, consumables and waste, transport, water and carbon. And we have proposed a set of indicators to go about doing that. Next, please. At the regional sphere of impact, we know that cities have profound impacts on their surrounding hinterland. We're also looking at a number of tools. Next, please. These are the species threat abatement and recovery metric. This is a tool, a multi-partner effort that's under development. And essentially it's a means for identifying and setting conservation priorities using red list data and data on the threats posed to those threatened species. And secondly, we want to use this soft tool, which is the restoration opportunities assessment methodology. Now that's really an effort. It's a process by which you can build consensus to conserve and restore conserve and restore areas that may be degraded. And it's important in cities where land is often hotly contested, but also in the bioregion where there might be multiple different users that need to be brought to the table. Next, please. Okay, I think maybe we can skip a couple of slides. I'm also conscious of the time. In the urban sphere of impact, thank you, the urban sphere of impact, next please, we have looked through the literature and there are many, many indicators out there. There are many indices out there from the ISO, the International Standards Organization, which has entire suites of indicators for sustainable cities, for smart cities, for resilient cities, to the Singapore Index, which I mentioned earlier, and you'll hear about more from Jeremy. And rather than duplicate, we've been seeking to distill the indicators and put them into categories, into clusters. And so in the urban realm, we look at the quality of green infrastructure. We look at the extent of green and blue infrastructure, but we also look at urban agriculture and air quality. So we're considering nature in a very broad sense here. Next, please. And we also examine benefit indicators. Now, I know that's very small writing for your screen, so don't worry about reading it, but it's just to show you that we currently have a very long list of indicators that we're working with. And the challenge for us over the next few months will actually be in whittling it down, in selecting strategically the best set of indicators that can help to meaningfully assess the ecological performance of cities, whilst also aligning with existing frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals and their indicators, like the emerging CBD post-2020 framework and so forth. Next, please. Okay, that's just an overview of the Urban Nature Index. And, oh, the writing has popped up a bit large, but in any case, this is a timeline. We want to, towards the end of this year, start building this online digital dashboard, which will be a presentation, a virtual presentation of the Urban Nature Index with some spatial facilities and opportunities for cities to disclose their results. And then in 2021, next year, at the World Conservation Congress, we hope to soft launch it and then to begin rolling it out across cities. Next, please. I just want to quickly thank all the contributors thus far, and there are many others not listed here, but these are some names that have really helped to drive it forward. Next, please. And I want to conclude with a picture of Edinburgh. This is actually just outside my window, and it's a beautiful day here, in fact. That's the Water of Leith. And not so long ago, the Water of Leith was a gushing torrent of sewage and industrial effluent. Those buildings you can see in the background were mostly mills, factories, and warehouses. But over many decades of concerted conservation action, the water has been brought back to life, and it now teems with life. And its riverbanks have been restored, partly to combat flooding. There were terrible floods. I believe the last major one was in the year 2000, but it's an example of conservation that works, and conservation that works in cities. And when it works, we all benefit. Nature wins, we win, and our cities are so much richer for it. But in order to achieve that, we need to have the data available to show us where to intervene and how to evaluate the efficacy of our impacts. So thank you very much. It was a bit of a rush presentation, but I'm very conscious of the time. I want to give the other speakers plenty of time as well to speak. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Russell. And thank you for making your way through that so efficiently. It's wonderful to see the Urban Nature Index really taking shape and form now. And I have no doubt already it's shaping into a very powerful tool for cities to be able to assess their ecological performance. So thank you for presenting that. I think it's going to be a key part of really the overall monitoring and reporting efforts, especially in relation to the post-2020 framework. And it's interesting to see how all these different metrics and tools and mechanisms, each have a very specific sort of niche, and how they all sort of complement each other. So on that note, another metric that is very complementary to the two that have already been presented, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to Mr. Jeremy Yap from the National Parks Board in Singapore. And Jeremy has prior experience in international relations, but works closely with the team in IBC to advocate for urban biodiversity conservation, both regionally and internationally, and is really working as centrally on the review of the Singapore Index for Cities and Biodiversity. So Jeremy, it's wonderful to have you with us today, and thank you for taking the time and joining us. And over to you to present another exciting metric for us. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Timothy, for the introduction. And thank you for Timothy and the team at eClay CBC for organizing this thematic session as well. I'm Jeremy, if you're not familiar, and I'm excited to be representing the National Parks Board Singapore to provide an update on the Singapore Index, which has been a combination of all the hard work put in by Lina and the team. So in this presentation, I'll be aiming to just give a quick introduction of the Singapore Index, so look into each of the components of the updated Singapore Index, so as to give you a little bit of a flavor of the coverage of indicators, and share with you quickly on Singapore's experience with the SI. So Timothy, next slide, please. Okay, so for those who have not heard of the Singapore Index, it is essentially a self-assessment tool designed to help cities and local and subnational governments monitor and evaluate their biodiversity efforts over time. So I'd like to cover and highlight some of its key features, as you can see on the slide. First, it's a quantitative scoring mechanism based on robust science. Second, it caters to cities with varying city contexts, such as population size, geographical size, and even cities of varying latitudes. And it's a self-assessment tool for cities, which is easy to apply, and there's even a user's manual to guide users in the application process. Next, please. Yeah, so Singapore is in this unique position where we are both a city as well as a party to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And this makes us really a good candidate to develop a biodiversity conservation monitoring tool for cities all around the world to measure their conservation efforts. So about a decade ago, back in Bonn, Germany, our then Minister Ma Bao Tan, he first announced about the Singapore Index and first announced on embarking on this project. 3 expert workshops later and 3 years later, we completed the first version of the Singapore Index in October 2011. And as you can see on the rightmost of your slide, we organized the 4th expert workshop just last year, which Russell was heavily involved as well, to revise the Singapore Index. Next, please. The decision to revise the Singapore Index came at the back of many groundbreaking findings about our planet's biodiversity and the looming threat of climate change. So to name one, the IPBES Global Assessment Report highlighted that nature was declining at an unprecedented rate with grave impacts to people. And one of the main causes was actually the doubling of urban areas since 1992. So cities have a great role to play in this. Next, please. So this is just a neat photo of the participants at the workshop in the Botanic Gardens hosted in Singapore. The 4th expert workshop was conducted in collaboration with the Secretariat on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and was attended by 29 participants comprising the technical task force, which were members that helped in the formulation of the original Singapore Index, resource experts in various fields, representatives from renowned and international organizations, as well as city representatives from cities who have applied the Singapore Index. Next, please. So I'd just like to highlight 4 key deliberations arising from the workshop. The first one is actually the most important, where the experts agreed to revise the indicators based on the emerging trends, such as habitat restoration, climate change, linkages between biodiversity and health, as well as new and improved methods for measuring urban biodiversity conservation work. We also revised indicators to improve their applicability for cities and responded to cities' feedback on many of the indicators. Last was a revision of the application period from 3 years to 5 years, just to allow for ecological changes, which take a while to take effect. Next, please. So this is the original Singapore Index, which had 3 main components. The first component of native biodiversity observes the current state of biodiversity in the city. The second component on ecosystem services measures the level of ecosystem services provided by the city's biodiversity. And the governance and management component, which looks at policies and measures that cities have put in place to conserve their biodiversity. So the original index had 23 indicators according to the allocations, as you can see on the screen. So let me take you through the changes of the revised Singapore Index. Now we have 28 indicators, but we're still sticking to the 3 original components which the original Singapore Index had. This is the native biodiversity component. So if you look at the bottom left of the screen, there's a little animation there that's supposed to happen. So Tim, we need to click it. Yes, so 2 species indicators were removed from the component, and the taxonomic group on butterflies was replaced by arthropods to cover a wider range of invertebrates. So there'll be 3 species indicators there. Next, Tim. We also added a new indicator on habitat restoration, measuring the proportion of habitat restored to good ecological functioning. Next, please. So in summary, the native biodiversity component will now have 9 indicators, and the updates are as follow. I'll not go into detail because we are slightly short of time. So next, please. So for our ecosystem services indicator, we retained indicators 10 and 12 on regulation of water as well as the park provision ratio respectively. We amended indicator 11, acknowledging the wide range of benefits that trees and greenery can bring. So Tim, if you might just press that, yes. And for indicator 13, we replaced it with a new indicator measuring households' proximity to parks as a proxy for city residents' health, based on a lot of the research that's been done in that area. So if you will, Tim. Yeah, that's the replacement. Finally, we added 2 new indicators, one on natural capital assessment, as well as urban agriculture. So this is, again, is a summary of changes that you can see. The number of indicators here has increased to 6 because we recognize the importance of cities measuring ecosystem services indicators. Okay, next, please. So moving on to the governance indicators, we had an original set of 9 indicators which we are retaining, but we heard cities' feedback and we normalized 2 of the indicators for population size. So now they measure things per million. Thank you. Next. Besides that, we also added 4 new indicators to the governance component so as to cover a wider range of topics, including nature-based responses to climate change, green infrastructure, community science involvement, as well as the assessment of greenery management plans. So all these additions, they kind of sought to address new policy domains that have emerged pertaining to biodiversity conservation across the years. We wanted to make sure that the governance and management indicators were comprehensive. So this is a summary of the changes. So the number of indicators here has increased from 9 to 13. Next, please. Okay, so moving on to why the Singapore Index. So if you haven't already, if you aren't really convinced that the Singapore Index is a tool that all cities should adopt to monitor biodiversity conservation efforts, I'll take you through some of the reasons why we think it is a powerful tool for cities. First, the SI will help cities to create baselines for the state of their biodiversity and monitor progress over time. We want longitudinal data when it comes to monitoring progress in our biodiversity conservation work. Next, is the SI is also a great way to create a network of stakeholders that is important for biodiversity conservation issues in order to effectively address these issues. We believe that the SI is also a great way to raise awareness among citizens to kind of create a momentum behind cities' biodiversity conservation work. Next, the SI can also serve as a set of guidelines. Sorry, Tim, yes. For the 4th point, the SI can also serve as a set of guidelines on how cities can go about their biodiversity conservation work if they are still new to the area. It's a cross-cutting tool with many applications, even in urban planning. And lastly, it gives city planners a basis to first value biodiversity and then allocate the appropriate level of resources towards conserving it. Next, please. So in closing, let me just share with you quickly Singapore's experience with the Singapore Index. The SI has provided important policy guidance to help develop Singapore from a city in the garden to its current state as a biophilic city in the garden. And what I mean by that is that the SI has helped to help us to maintain an ecological approach to our urban planning, and it's ensured that Singapore continues to build a sustainable ecosystem, not just for nature, but for people as well. And the Singapore Index, as a spin-off, the Singapore Index has also helped to raise awareness among Singaporeans about the value of biodiversity and the need to conserve it for future generations. Just to end off, we are aiming to actually use a revised version of the Singapore Index, which will be a more comprehensive one, to measure our progress towards our new vision as a city in nature. And we hope cities all around the world will come together and join us in this process to conserve our planet's biodiversity, starting with the place where most people are living right now, which is in cities. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you for taking the time to be with us and to share some insights from this incredible work and this amazing review process. We look forward to seeing the final product and to engaging with it. And I'm sure I can speak for everyone on the call to say that we're very excited. That concludes our sort of presentations on different tools and mechanisms that are available, different metrics to measure progress. And very excitingly, I'm hoping that we can start to see, the picture coming together, how these various tools complement each other, and how in the future, just a note to say that all of our teams are working very closely together. ICLEI, the team in Singapore, and the IUCN Urban Alliance team, to ensure that there's close alignment in what we're doing, that we're really improving the service offering for cities. So on that note, we're really excited to be joined by Miss Julie Dewar from the City of Edinburgh Council, and she is going to provide us a first-hand city experience in monitoring progress. And Julie is a senior planning officer working for the planning service for the City of Edinburgh Council. She specializes in biodiversity, designated sites, green and blue infrastructure, and partnership work. And she also advises on the development management casework for developments across the city. So Julie, it's wonderful to have you with us, and it's very exciting to be able to turn now to a local government example, and we are thrilled to have you with us. So without further ado, over to you, and go for it.
Thank you, Tim. That's great, and it's really good to be here. And having listened to the previous speakers, I inevitably we still have so much to learn. But I just want to share what is our sort of gritty reality of day to day and how we do biodiversity monitoring in Edinburgh. So if you could go to the second slide, please. So the context in which we work is legal, policy and projects. And I just want to say that that particular photograph is our council headquarters roof, and it's a great example of a green roof. Next slide, please. So as a local authority and as a public body, we actually have a duty to further biodiversity in everything we do. So that's a really good grounding for our work. It was originally just a duty to do the work. Now it's actually to report. Next slide, please. So on a 3-year basis, we have to do a council-wide report on all the work that we're doing across the council to further biodiversity. And it's really about more than just doing the norm. It's about trying to step further than beyond that and do something a bit more special. So just some of the highlights from the council from the planning side of things. So next slide, please. Because I work in planning, I just wanted to highlight that we do, as all planning authorities, a local plan every 5 years. And what we try and do is make the policies within that plan particularly strong on biodiversity. So not just the normal natural environment policies you would expect, but actually design policies which talk about enhancing biodiversity. And as Russell was talking about the Water of Leith, any development near the Water of Leith, we need that to be really good standard. Next slide, please. And we also inevitably, as planning, have to do good mapping of our green spaces, our ecological network, so we can look at where we can do good management and where we can look at where developments that are taking part may need to make extra provision for the natural environment. Next slide, please. I mentioned the policy work we're doing. So we, as the Biodiversity Partnership, we do the survey work and the assessment work of where the swifts are in the city, for example, but through the development planning policy work, we actually ensure we get the swift bricks into the development. So it's that thread through of what we do in our duty and how we actually make that effective in our planning as well. So next slide, please. But then moving on to the biodiversity action planning itself, where do we look for guidance on how our biodiversity action plans should be? So in Scotland, we have the route map, obviously that's due to be updated. And then we also have a geodiversity charter, because often we think at the local level, but geodiversity can be forgotten. So we use those as our guidance. Next slide, please. But also we have lots of documents within the council. We have our open space strategy, we have an adaptation strategy, we have a sustainability strategy. So we have to look to all these documents and all these different monitoring frameworks to try and come up with something which is workable on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So from that, we produce our Edinburgh Biodiversity Action Plan. Next slide, please. That's the most recent plan, 2019 to 21. Just by way of background, the council leads it. We have biodiversity officers and we chaired it for many years, but now it's chaired by the Royal Botanic Gardens, which is fantastic because they're all their science and knowledge. There's 30 organisations, government agencies, bodies, etc. We produce a plan every 3 years. We're currently in our 5th plan, and this year, had it not been for coronavirus, we would have been having some great 20th year celebrations of that partnership, because it really is essential partnership. Next slide, please. So there are really 3 ways that we look to measure. We have our annual report on progress, we have a mini state of the environment assessment, and we have a set of ecological and community engagement initiatives. Next slide, please. So that's just our annual report, hot off the press. I'll be sending links to that. Next slide, please. And I think it was Tim that mentioned about, it's not so much about number crunching in terms of species, etc. Inevitably, we do have a little bit of that in our annual report. So I don't need to go into all those, but they'll look familiar to you, you know, different recording of species, community action, developing some metrics, education, and then species reintroduction as well. Next slide, please. So on the mini state of the report, we've chosen some species that we think help us determine how Edinburgh's health is looking in terms of biodiversity. So sparrowhawk, we have a lot of pollinator projects in Edinburgh. We have a big project that some of you will be aware of, the Edinburgh Living Landscapes project, which is led by David Jamieson's team, and I sit on that board looking to increase our pollinators across the city. We work with plant people to look at how the plants are changing in the city, and then work with people on webs and bird counts. Next slide, please. So just an example of that, the Firth of Forth, the coast around Edinburgh, we have a World Heritage Bridge, but it's also world renowned for its bird species. So we measure and monitor those bird species, which is a good way of looking at the health of that environment. And we work with a government agency doing that every 6 years. Next slide, please. So in terms of other ecosystem health indicators, again, a lot of these will look familiar. Our coverage of trees, and going to what Russell was saying about on a more regional basis, our river basin management planning, that's about our local rivers, but it's much more about what's happening at the regional level. So we in Edinburgh do our bit towards that. Examples might be putting in fish passages in rivers to allow the salmon and fish to move up the river. As I mentioned previously, we work with the government agency on site conditioning monitoring of designated sites, gains and losses through developments, I'll come to that, and also soil and vacant and derelict land, very important issues we look at in planning. Next slide, please. So gains and losses in planning, and the Singapore Index talks about green infrastructure in its new iteration, which is fantastic for us in a city. So we work with the schools to do green roofs, we work with developers to look at biodiverse suds, and we have this guidance manual to help us work with them to deliver that. And this tile at the corner of the slide, this is something we're using on the concrete areas along our coastlines, which we have many of, to try and encourage biodiversities to establish and to make those areas much more rich. Next slide, please. And then we also have community engagement indicators. So as has been mentioned, we have citizen science projects. We have Water of Leith, a lot of businesses volunteer along there to help to engage the business community. We have rangers who do species introduction, and that includes local scientists, not just people within the organisations, but getting local people involved. And we have an organisation, Edinburgh Lothians Green Space Trust, who do a lot of community engagement in areas where maybe the communities wouldn't naturally come out into the environment. And these are all measures of how we're changing and making that more accessible. And this year we were involved in the City's Nature Challenge, which is excellent. That's the iNaturalist, and it's not something we've done before, so we're trying to get more technical. And next year we're hoping to do a sort of bit of friendly rivalry with Glasgow, which is our next biggest city. Next slide, please. So all of these look at making our landscapes healthier and the well-being of the city. Food growing, I think Russell, you mentioned that as one of your measures. Lots of food growing projects in the city, changing the way we manage our land for pollinators, getting people involved, and encouraging access. Planning should be, a key role of planning should be to encourage people to access nature and enjoy and understand it. So we need to measure how well we're doing with that. Next slide, please. And I've mentioned the species reintroduction using local scientists, and that's great for the butterflies, particularly in that not many cities have a volcano, but in Edinburgh we're lucky enough to have a volcano. Next slide, please. And we were really privileged to go to Singapore. We adopted the Singapore Index a number of years ago and had used it to a degree. We then re-looked at it before going to Singapore in October, and we're really excited to see that coming out and to applying the new Biodiversity Action Plan to that. So that was great. Next slide, please. But one thing it's worth mentioning in all that's been discussed already, you know, cities are in a challenging time. Edinburgh's developing a vision for 2050 and green space and environment is coming out high there. We want to be carbon neutral by 2030. We have housing pressures. Again, that's a regional issue, global issue. We have lots of visitors and students in Edinburgh and lots of transport issues. So all of this, we sit in the context of trying to deliver biodiversity and measure it in that context. Next slide, please. So there are inevitably challenges, data sets, resources, how often do we analyse, and how do we make this all meaningful? Just looking at all the information we've discussed this morning, it can be a bit mind-blowing, and to look at all that and share it with our councillors and the people in the council, we've got to make it meaningful and understandable. Next slide, please. But we are committed to a sustainable and resilient Edinburgh going forward, and we are very lucky in Edinburgh have dedicated people to do that. So next slide, please. So we are celebrating 20 years, we're a strong partnership and we hope to continue that. And if you'd like to know more, you can look at either of those links. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. I think that's really useful to sort of ground these metrics and different tools that we presented in real application at the local and subnational level. So thank you for being with us and for taking the time, and it's great to have the experience of Edinburgh reflected in this webinar, especially, you know, since this is part of the Edinburgh process. So we're honored to have had you with us. I realize that we are running out of time. We do have a little bit of time for a few questions. I see that there has been some active engagement in the chat box, and I'm trying to keep up with that. And I'm going to ask my colleagues from the Scottish Government, Sue and John, to help me just in identifying some questions. We're going to briefly open the floor for any questions live. So you could either raise your hand in the panel or make use of the chat box, but please, we are opening we want to hear from you. So if there's any reflections or questions to any of the panelists specifically, or general comments, we ask that you let us know now. Leonard, sorry, go for it, Sue.
I was just going to say that one of the issues that's come up in the chat is when you were talking about what you and Russell were talking about, the urban indices. They're very well received, but how can we make sure that those indexes for the urban situation are scaled up to the regional level? I think Russell replied a little bit on the chat, but it would be really good to perhaps have a bit of discussion about that.
Russell, do you want to go for it?
Thanks, Timothy. Perhaps I should have qualified this urban nature index that we've been developing. It's really geared towards cities. I must be frank about that. But there are elements of it which are also applicable to regions. So we know that, you know, if you increase connectivity, it's beneficial for biodiversity. If you increase patch size, or, you know, if you improve the management, habitat diversity, naturalness, or native species diversity, that's important at the region as much as it is within the city. But yeah, I think perhaps cities with nature, in developing the new regions with nature, Timothy, you might be able to explain if you have a similar commitment platform plan for that.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. So my apologies, I'm going to try and play a dual role of both moderator and respond. And I see that Lena also wants to chime in a bit on the scalability and comment on the plan of action. So before I hand over to Lena, I just want to highlight that we have very excitingly announced that we will soon be developing the regional component of Cities with Nature. The platform in its current form is very much open to subnational and regional governments. But we are really, we've identified the need to make this very specific and explicit going forward. So we've actually announced now that we'll be working with a few of our key partners, including Regions 4 and others, to develop what we are going to call Regions with Nature, which will be the sort of sister platform to Cities with Nature. The regional aspects are certainly going to be taken into account in the design of the commitment platform to make that, the regional scalability issues very explicit in the commitments themselves as well. So the aim is to offer, in a sense, a menu of commitments, some which are more applicable to the urban level, some which are more applicable to the regional level, and in doing so really enable a flexible approach where either a city or a regional government could, in a sense, pick and choose. And again, it's not saying, that we need to come up with all new commitments. Some of them have already been made, and it's about capturing the contributions that these various levels of subnational government are making to the global framework. So I think if, Lena, if I can hand over to you, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
So nice to see all of you. Yeah, I like your haircut, Russell. You managed to get to the hairdresser with the lockdown. But anyway, so very quickly, I am trying to actually put in a few words in the plan of action, because it's so important. This year is going to be the 10th year, and at COP15, we need to actually work very hard on actually extending the plan of action. For those of you who might not be so familiar with it, 10 years ago at Nagoya, this was the first time that we managed to get the Conference of the Parties to agree to a decision that they would recognize the greater role of subnational governments and cities and local communities. And I think at the recent meetings in Rome, that's the open-ended working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, there were many interventions recognizing that we need to implement the global biodiversity framework post-2020. And the only way to do it is by being comprehensive, inclusive. Everybody has to actually take a part, which means that everyone, local communities, cities, and subnational governments play an extremely important role. So then the next question is, how do you engage them? I mean, that was one of the questions, how do you actually bring in the participation of local communities, subnational governments and cities? The best way would be through the local biodiversity strategy and action plans, and by cities applying various kind of indices and then collating them and then show how important it is. These are the indicators. This is how we are doing. Because in 2020, in 2000, what we did was that when we embarked on the IG targets, we were looking for indicators in 2010. So I think we should actually fast forward. We have the indicators. Let's get on and start right from 2021. And monitoring is extremely important, because if we don't monitor, you won't know, as we said, how are we progressing? And we don't have the time. We need to monitor, and we have the technology, we have the indicators. Let's get on with it and involve everybody. So I think we have all connected now. Let's now network and help each other along and push. I think the key thing to push is actually the extension of the plan of action. I think that's very important. The other thing is, I really would like to thank the Scottish Government for taking the lead in this very important process. I think that's really great for you all to actually do it and initiate this Edinburgh process. Thank you very much, Sue. And equally, of course, and IUCN for helping to make this happen. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lena. Thank you for your insights, and I completely agree. You know, as we mobilize all together, you know, it's really clear that we need a strong position in calling for this dedicated and stepped up decision on local and subnational governments, that, you know, for a renewed plan of action. So thank you for making that very important point. I'm wondering, Sue or John, if you can help me identify some of the questions.
There was a question directly for you, Tim, on the Cities with Nature platform, which I can't find. It's typical. You have it on your screen and then it disappears.
Sue, I got one question that is, why do we have a separate Singapore index and an urban nature index, which would be useful to answer?
Thanks. I was actually just typing a response. Yeah, no, good question. So IUCN has been involved from the outset in the development of the Singapore Index, and is, you know, we're one of the leading champions of this, and hold it in high esteem. And actually, the rationale for developing the Urban Nature Index was really to expand the scope. So the Singapore Index has a focus on urban nature, urban biodiversity, promoting it through improved management and governance, improving the benefits rendered by urban nature, and of course improving the quality of urban nature. Whereas the Urban Nature Index is an awkward name. I have actually wondered whether we should have called it something different, like the Ecological Performance Index. But essentially it's also looking at the relationship between cities and their immediate adjacent hinterland, so the bioregion. That could be the watershed, but beyond the administrative boundaries, as well as the ecological footprint, which is of course very important. And I want to stress that last point. You know, we know, and it's emphasized in all the latest, you know, IP-best global assessments and reports, we know that cities have ecological footprints that can be hundreds of times larger than their physical urban footprint. If we want to save life on Earth, if we want to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is consumption. And cities may not have full control over the consumption in their administrative boundaries, but they can still influence it. They can still affect change. So through green procurement, you know, there are cities like the city of Stockholm, I believe, is a champion of green procurement, through phasing out meat in public schools, the way New York has done on Mondays, the way that Cape Town, when it came within a hair's breadth of dreaded day zero running out of fresh water, it drastically reduced its water consumption. So there are ways that cities can actually improve their ecological footprint, even if they don't have full control over the purchasing decisions and behaviors of all their citizens and companies. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thanks Russell for that clarification. I think it's certainly useful. And yeah, we look forward to seeing the Urban Nature Index and the Singapore Index come to life. Sorry, did you want to add something, Russell?
Yes, I was just going to add as well that it is our hope, and Lena, we should have a discussion at some point soon, but it's our hope that we can also incorporate the Singapore Index into this digital dashboard that we're developing for launch in early 2021. And so this is a discussion that's ongoing.
Can I say something, Tim, please?
Absolutely, go for it.
Yeah. Well, like what Russell started off with when he looked at, you know, all the phones and all, now which one do I choose? So I think it's the same thing. For the Singapore Index, we were at that time quite realistic. Well, I won't say that other people are not realistic, but we were very focused. We wanted to encourage, first, we wanted to show that there is native biodiversity in the cities, because at that time, 10 years ago, people didn't think that there could be biodiversity in the cities. So that's one. And we wanted to say, hey, we can actually live with native biodiversity in cities, and they are important for us. So that's why we focus on biodiversity in cities. We knew that it's important to take into account your ecological footprint and various other things, but we felt that that would distract us. And plus, for any index to be workable and for it to be done by a city council, we didn't want to actually belabel them with so many like 100 indicators. And we felt that an index should have a basket of just about 30 indicators, strong, robust, very meaningful, and actually just give us what we want to measure. And that's very important, which is why we didn't want to have like 50, 60 indicators. And we didn't want too few because then it wouldn't be robust enough. So we then came up with this number, which we thought covered enough and it is manageable. And I think that's very important. And we can then extend. There are other indices that will measure other things. So we didn't want to actually clutter up with the Singapore index with other things that we were not focusing on. So we focus on improving biodiversity in cities. And in a way, if you follow and get a good score, it's actually, as Jeremy said, it helps you to actually increase biodiversity in cities. And we found that with COVID-19, a lot of the things we did actually paid very well. For example, we worked on parks near where you live. So the proximity, accessibility was very important. And it was for the sanity of the people who were locked down, couldn't go anywhere, but they had a park like 10 minutes away from where they could actually go for a jog. We also came up with an app that allows you to find which are the parks that are free, that are near you. So you can then actually then say, I'm going at a time where there are very few people around and parks near me, I don't have to drive there. So there are lots of things within the Singapore Index that actually prepared us for COVID-19, which we didn't realize. And now we're beginning to see, oh, wow, that's what, helped us survive. Yeah. So in climate change, I think the next thing. Yeah.
For sure. Thanks, Leonard. That's really helpful. I'm going to quickly try and respond to Dave's question, and thanks, Martha, for highlighting it for us. For some reason, when I try and scroll through the chat, it just jumps all over the place. But Dave asked, is Cities with Nature the standard, and how does it compare, complement, or compete with other networks? And how do we make it the place all cities can go to commit? So I think what I should start by explicitly saying is that, Cities with Nature is deliberately a non-competitive space, and rather we're envisioning a sort of big tent that allows all the other initiatives to come underneath it and really complement each other in that way, and provide a shared space where we can share various different offerings. For example, we're in discussions on how we make the linkages between the commitment platform on Cities with Nature and the Singapore Index or the Urban Nature Index, for example. And so, in that way, we're not trying to compete with anyone. I think the specific value add of the commitment platform is really that it helps a city think through what are, a city or a region, what are the things that they can do to contribute specifically to the global targets, goals, and actions in the global biodiversity framework itself. So, we're hoping to answer the last bit of the question on how do we make it the place where all cities come and commit. We can't do that alone. We're hoping that everyone will come together in support of the initiative and really promote it, that it's a complementary initiative to other networks and see how we can bring these networks in. So I hope that that's done some justice to answering the question.
If I can just jump in, there's a sort of complementary question, Tim, which is being raised from the Basque Country, asking about how do you apply the different analysis and tools if there's no standard or methodology? How can you apply these across regional level? when it's really difficult for people to make decisions about the data at a global level, because at the regional level there needs to be a bit more detail, and some of the indicators are very generic.
Yeah. Russell, do you want to come in here, or shall I?
I can add 2 cents. So, I mean, it's a really important point. Currently, cities around the world are using different methodologies to monitor their biodiversity or their environmental quality more broadly. And this impedes meaningful comparisons, both within a city over time, you know, between neighborhoods, between ecosystems, and indeed between cities themselves. And if the CBD is to, you know, comprise multiple goals and targets that can be disaggregated, you know, between all the various institutions that need to be contributing towards this apex target, whatever that may be, then we need to have a consistent set of indicators that are used. And so what IUCN is attempting to do with this Urban Nature Index, and I should have perhaps stressed this stronger, is actually create some standards for monitoring air quality, for monitoring connectivity. You know, obviously that's been achieved by the Singapore Index. So in many cases, it's just a case of alluding to what's already the international best practice. There are also international standards, by the way. The ISO, the International Standards Organization, has a whole raft of indicators that have been agreed through a very scrupulous, iterative process by global experts. So there's a lot out there. But I think what Lena said is also very true, that we don't want to overwhelm cities, because we know how challenging monitoring and reporting can be. So the art, I think, in all of this is actually selecting the most meaningful and useful set of indicators that can you know, help the city to assess its performance, but also to contribute towards global goals as well.
And it might be worth, if I can just add on to what Russell's saying, it might be worth mentioning the work of a group called the Science-Based Targets Network, that is really, you know, a consortium of various organizations that are coming together to work specifically on this methodology and the tools that will equip and enable cities to undergo the process of setting science-based targets for nature. So, you know, we're hoping, we're watching and involved in that group to see how that will sort of bring all the pieces together in a sense, and really equip the cities with a robust methodology and tools to think through the process of how they arrive and actually set targets that are science-based and essentially then their sort of fair share in contributing to the global overall goals. So I hope, are there any other burning questions? Is anyone, I can't see if there's any hands raised for some reason.
Don't see any.
Okay, it doesn't look like, sorry.
I have one personal question, Tim. Looking through the presentations, I noticed that obviously the focus is very much on terrestrial biodiversity in relation to cities, and I know obviously cities have more control over that, but obviously I come from a marine background, so I'm interested in, particularly when we're looking at the wider influence that cities have over the regions, how the marine aspects can be taken into that as well. When we're looking also at consumption, we're talking about red meat, but cities also have a big impact on fisheries and consumption, and probably in an even wider area around due to supply chains. And it's just be interesting to get the views of the panelists on how they think the marine impacts can also be brought in more in terms of indicators, because I didn't see a huge number of indicators. There's obviously some on water quality, but covering the marine elements of the impact of cities.
Okay, so thanks for that question. I couldn't actually see who was asking, but I think it was John's voice. So I was wondering if maybe I could call on Jeremy. Do you want to, I just realized you haven't responded. If not, I'll open it to any of the panelists if you'd like to respond.
Sure. Thanks, John, for the question. I think some of the limitations of the SI is that it doesn't look at certain aspects, such as what Russell has mentioned, the ecological footprint of cities, and as you have mentioned, as you have raised the marine environment aspect. But the strength of the SI is actually in just focusing cities on how they can manage their terrestrial biodiversity. The closest that we have to looking at managing marine habitats would be the regulation of water, which looks more towards freshwater streams and freshwater habitats, which cities have plenty as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question.
Tim, can I just maybe answer John's question? John, when we developed the Singapore Index, the indicators, we did not forget the marine environment. So there are things like habitat enhancement. That can be applied to your coastal and marine ecosystems. Similarly with species, like so there are areas where we actually allow for cities to actually bring in the marine biodiversity conservation. But as I said, the Singapore Index focus on the biodiversity rather than the ecological impact. So again, we can take it offline, and I could start connecting with you and talking to you about how we have thought about it, applying the Singapore Index on coastal and marine environments. Thanks.
Thanks, Lena. Russell, did you want to make a comment, or shall we move on?
Very quickly, there's actually an SDG indicator, 14.1.1, which is Index of Coastal Eutrophication and Floating Plastic Debris Density. So that's something that cities can already utilize. And of course, they may not be fully responsible for all the plastic debris in the marine environment that next to them, but it's still something that could be measured.
And just to add, John, rest assured, in the commitment platform, we will have a strong marine component as well, specifically in relation to the local and subnational contributions to the overall marine targets in the framework. There's an interesting question in the chat. Aside from the direct benefits of having nature itself, are there any incentives for reporting on these indicators specifically? I wonder if any of our panelists would like to address this. Are there any incentives for reporting? Go for it.
Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but this is a really good question, right? Because often as a conservationist, I think, oh, everyone should have biodiversity at the top of their agenda, but it's not really the case. We know that cities have much more pressing priorities. They have to address societal challenges, food security, water security, disaster risk reduction, mitigating heat stress, reducing flood risk. These are all important, but they can also be addressed through the deployment of nature-based solutions. And I think the more we align conservation with development, the more we can use these indicators as a means not just to bringing back biodiversity into urban areas and reducing the ecological footprint of cities, but rather to strengthening their resilience in the face of climate change, but rather to improving public health and well-being, but rather to catalyzing the economy by attracting high caliber professionals to beautiful scenic areas. The better we can get at aligning conservation with development, I think the greater and the more self-evident the incentive will be for implementing these indicators.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think that is something that in Edinburgh we really feel is really important going forward, that link between greening the grey, if you like, linking people. I think we learned that when we went to Singapore, that importance of engaging people in the understanding of the importance of biodiversity for mental health, and in the current environment we can really feel that. So I think there is a general greater understanding of the importance of the connection between the two, and how important biodiversity is just innately in how we live.
Yeah, and I think that the health aspects to biodiversity and nature are really important. They affect everybody, whether that's in a smaller scale, urban level, or larger scales in rural environments. Having access to green areas and areas with biodiversity is important for everyone, and we need to encourage the whole of society to be getting behind all of the initiatives that we put in place at local, regional and global levels. So, very important question there.
For sure.
Tim, maybe, I know we're prolonging it, just very quick point. The government can actually do a lot in giving incentives. Like, for example, our Building and Construction Authority has this green mark. And buildings can actually come up with platinum, and then they showcase. For example, the Urban Redevelopment Authority actually gives incentives, like, you know, or rules and regulations, set rules and regulations. If you actually cut so many trees, you have to actually replace it with that same amount of greenery. So there are lots of incentives. Edmonton actually shared with us and said that they scored very well in some industrial, a magazine. And every year they actually rank cities. And Edmonton and Montreal came up very well, because one of the criteria that they measured was actually, did your city apply a biodiversity index? And they quoted and they said they applied the Singapore index, and they had top score or something like that for that particular, you know, part. So I think there are many ways, there are incentives that you haven't seen, but they exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks for all your insights today. I'm mindful of the time, and we unfortunately going to have to close. I think there's been quite a few questions in the chat box around the sharing of this webinar recording and the presentation. And just to let everyone know that all of this will be made available through Attendify. The webinar has been recorded. So I'd like to just direct everyone to Attendify. If you haven't registered yet, express interest. I'll show the inquiries email address in a second. But for those who have registered, all of the details will be on Attendify. So for me, I'm also seeing in the chat box, and I want to echo what Sue has said, you know, this is a discussion that is very much ongoing. And I hope that this has been a place where we can start to make those connections and continue to collaborate in pursuit of a robust monitoring and reporting framework, not only for the parties, but for local and subnational governments at all levels of subnational government, especially in the next decade. Before I show just the last few slides, this is my, thank you on behalf of ICLEI and the city's Biodiversity Centre for, it's been an absolute honour and privilege to host this webinar as part of the Edinburgh process. I want to thank all of our panelists who have joined us, and of course everyone who has participated. And just finally, as I've said, I want to direct everyone's attention to Attendify. This will be the main platform for any information and updates related to the Edinburgh process. And it's here that you can also find details around the other thematic webinars that will be happening throughout the course of the next month. So with that, I'd like to close the webinar and really just thank the Scottish Government for their leadership and for putting this ambitious online consultation process together. We as ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre, as well as various other regional offices, are thrilled and honoured to have been partners to this process and to have worked with the other group of partners. You can see at the bottom of your screen now is the inquiries email for anyone who is still to register and access all of the wealth of resources and discussions, as well as the consultation documents through Attendify. And with that, I just want to say a final thank you to everyone for joining us today, and thank you to the Scottish Government for the opportunity to host this webinar. So with that, I will close and just thank everyone for their participation.